The Great Wolf Sif is one of the most memorable fights in the Dark Souls series, and a big part of why it's memorable is because of how it contextualizes the act of violence in a meaningful way. If you do enough damage to Sif during the fight, they'll begin to limp and appear too weary to fight effectively anymore. It's at this point that you realize that to kill Sif would be a very cruel thing. But why does Sif specifically evoke this feeling of sorrow for players? Well, there's three basic reasons. The first is that Sif is basically a big dog, and people generally empathize with and appreciate dogs. Dogs are viewed as innocent and naive, and so we see Sif and immediately project those feelings onto them. The second is that, if you know Sif's backstory, you understand that Sif is protecting Artorias' grave from being robbed. Artorias is Sif's long-dead master, and Sif does not want you to desecrate Artorias' grave or steal the Covenant of the Abyss. It's clear that Sif's loyalty to their master and Sif's resolve to not let you pass is so strong that they won't give up even when they're near death, continuing to fight despite it being futile to do so. This makes the boss fight take on an element of tragedy, and you are the one instigating the tragedy, which provokes feelings of guilt. The third reason, and this is most important, is because we see that Sif feels pain. Pain is something that isn't often emphasized in games, and rarely systematized into a game's mechanics. Even the player character is completely unaffected by a low health bar, but to see that hurting Sif has affected Sif gives Sif a degree of subjectivity that other characters in the game don't get. In other words, we have gone from seeing Sif as an object standing in the way of our goal to a subject, a living creature who has motivations, feelings, and a body that can be affected by damage inflicted to it. Sif is an important moment in establishing a major theme of Dark Souls. See, Dark Souls is a game obsessed with violence, ethics, and the relationship between the two. The Sif fight implies that, though necessary for the progression of the story and gameplay, killing Sif is not a noble thing to do. You are not in the right to kill Sif. But rather than saying that it's strictly wrong, the Sif fight calls the whole dichotomy into question. If you have to kill Sif, but doing so causes serious misery to Sif, then is your cruelty justified, or isn't it? And how can we know what distinguishes the two possibilities? But the Sif fight is not actually what I want to talk about today. No. Today, I want to talk about the Mushroom Men. In Darkroot Garden, in the lead up to the Sif fight, the player might happen upon some small mushroom people wandering around aimlessly. At first, they're exclusively non-violent. If you attack them, they'll retreat to the center area of the woods, where they'll unite with much larger and much deadlier mushroom people. This moment makes it clear to the player that the mushroom people are a family. The large ones are parents, the small ones children. The children have an innocent quality, are largely defenseless, and are quite easy to kill, even potentially dropping gold pine resin as a reward for doing so. The mushroom parents can be deadly, but are one of the least aggressive enemies in the game, moving very slowly, attacking very slowly, and thus being a really low risk fight as long as you know what you're doing. Killing the entire mushroom family would be a pretty trivial exercise. The mushroom people being placed directly prior to the Sif fight functions as a subtle test on the player. The Sif fight is not the moment when a theme emerges, but when it's revealed to the player that this theme has been here the entire time. The fight is noteworthy because it makes explicit that your actions towards Sif are cruel and difficult to justify, but every prior encounter has had the same truth underlying it. It just wasn't obvious until you think about it, and the Sif fight is your biggest chance to really start to think about it. Every hollow, every dragon, every swamp monster or golem or lizard, every enemy type in the game presents a question on violence. You do have to kill enemies at some point or another to beat the game, but each time that you encounter a character, friendly or not, you are given an option: kill or spare. And when you choose one or the other, that choice will say something about you and your beliefs and your values. So the question has to be asked: can any killing in Dark Souls be justified? Because if you answer yes, from a mechanical perspective or an ethical perspective, you have to contend with a more complex moral question than games often give room for, and that players often aren't prepared to answer. Is killing a hollow justified? One might say yes for so many reasons. They can be revived when you rest at a bonfire, they've lost their minds completely and so they don't really have the subjectivity to feel pain, they're aggressive and killing them is an act of self-defense, etc, etc, etc. And sure, these answers might make the act of killing a hollow make sense, but no answer is going to be very satisfactory when you take the game in its totality. And if a hollow is justified, then what about the drakes? The drakes exist in a spot in the game that you're never required to go to, the Valley of the Drakes. They're mostly non-hostile unless you get close enough that they perceive you as a threat. They're an endangered species as a result of mass attacks on them by the gods. There's a lot to suggest that doing so might not be necessary or even right. But there are still justifications that can be made. They're in your way and are deadly, it's self-defense, you need dragon skills to level up your weapon, etc, etc, etc. There's always something that makes the killing make sense, but no answer is going to be perfectly satisfactory. Because something is supposed to gnaw away at the player as they play, and this culminates in the perfect moment. A small, innocent mushroom child that is clearly defenseless against you, completely unnecessary to kill in order to progress, easy to avoid, etc. Is killing the mushroom child justified? I think, given enough self-awareness, a lot of people would say no, but there can always be a reason to justify it. You need gold pine resin. You might just think it's funny to kill them. Regardless of what answer you pick, if you want to justify killing the mushroom children, you're revealing that, ultimately, you think that cruelty and the taking of a life can be okay or even good, and that just doesn't sit right. The mushroom family is placed before the Sif fight, so that you'll start to think maybe about how your actions throughout the game imply what you value when it comes to the lives of others. When you finally fight Sif, it becomes apparent that in this world, it is possible to commit acts of cruelty, and this cruelty is felt by those it's inflicted on. This is far from the only obvious example of cruelty in the game. The most obvious example is when Lautrec kills the Firekeeper. But the reason why this example stands out the most is because it's cruelty that has a direct effect on the player. Lautrec is after the Firekeeper. You're not relevant to his goals. But when you see Lautrec kill the Firekeeper for some sort of revenge or personal gain, you can identify his act as cruel in part because it makes the game harder for you. And so while we can empathize with the Firekeeper as a victim in this scenario, when we fight Lautrec to get her soul back, we discover that he is entirely remorseless. He believes fully that he is well within his right to kill this woman. This makes him clearly villainous to the player. But why? Can anything that is said about Lautrec be true of him, but not of you, given that you will at some point have to kill Sif for personal gain? There is only one distinction that can be made. Lautrec made a choice, but you had to kill Sif. But you didn't have to kill the Mushroom family. You could have left them alone. In fact, you don't have to kill the vast majority of enemies in the game. Aside from the bosses and one lone Snake Man, there is not a single enemy who is required to be killed to progress. We're conditioned to empathize more with some characters over others, to view non-human, aggressive, or ugly characters as okay to kill. We tend to view the NPCs who are humans, who are non-violent, as not okay to kill. We don't kill Solaire, we do kill Hollows. We don't kill Andre, we do kill Lautrec. We don't kill the Everlasting Dragon, we do kill the Hellkite Dragon. But in all of these decisions, there's an element of choice. Even bosses that are required still involve the choice to continue playing the game. But within these choices, there are consequences both objective and subjective, and there's also meaning being derived from either option. Do we spare Solaire because he's human? Because he's friendly? Because he's helpful? Because attacking him will cause him to fight back and it's a fight we're not ready for? These questions should be reflected on for every encounter. The crystal lizards are strictly non-violent, but they have obvious benefits which incentivize killing them. Is the incentive worth the taking of a life? Does it make the action less cruel? If personal gain for killing the crystal lizard is okay, then is it okay when Lautrec kills the Firekeeper? These sorts of ethical dilemmas might seem inconsequential to the narrative, but they're actually the narrative's basic foundation. The gods mercilessly slayed the everlasting dragons, who previously lived at peace with nature. The point is that they were the object, the other. They weren't like humans or like the gods, but they were a part of a peaceful world that was destroyed and replaced with a world of oppression and suffering. From my perspective at least, every encounter with a creature that can be killed or spared is a little test of if the player understands the ethical concerns of violence and domination that was presented from the jump with the opening cutscene. On this front, the Mushroom family sticks out to me in particular because it's a situation that destroys the friendly-enemy dichotomy. The Mushroom Children are an enemy type, but they're an enemy type that is so pathetic and defenseless that killing them is clearly just cruel. And they offer so little in terms of benefits that it doesn't seem like it's particularly advantageous from a mechanical standpoint either. But the Mushroom Parents are important because they generate an element of subjectivity just like the fight with Sif. They attack you to protect their family. You're intruding in their home and killing their children. In a very subtle way, this moment in the game conveys something to the player that they may not notice about the game until the Sif fight, but it was there the whole time. You are taking the lives of creatures that have lives outside of you and don't exist just to kill you. Every killing in the game presents some kind of tragedy, either clearly stated or deliberately understated. The Hollows were once people like you. You're going hollow yourself, and may one day become like them. The dragons are being hunted down to extinction. And don't even get me started on the differing tragedies of all the bosses. That's the topic for a whole other video. If your conclusion from this is that the game is saying that you or your character is a quote-unquote bad person, that's not only untrue, it's also beside the point. The game is not about moral character, it's about moral decisions. Each decision functions independently from those that came before it. It's just, you have to think about every decision you make, and not just those which feel story relevant. Because the story is the world. The world is how the game communicates meaning, and every act you take inside of the world is part of how that meaning gets constructed. Dark Souls is a very complex game because it constructs alternating meanings depending on what choices you make. After all, the Mushroom family only opens up if you buy the Crest of Artorias and open a shortcut which allows easy access to the Sif fight. If you take the long route, you may play through Dark Souls without ever encountering the Mushroom family, at which point the moral conundrum that comes from killing or sparing them is resolved without even being presented. They're spared because they never crossed your path. Likewise, you have the option to spare Lautrec or kill him, and while killing him is mechanically incentivized, his death too is called into question within the narrative. Lautrec is an example of a high-level play decision, while the Mushroom family are an example of low-level play decisions. But Dark Souls takes both of these elements of storytelling seriously, because regardless of if it's these big overarching story decisions or just the decisions you make from moment to moment, neither result in a perfectly ethical decision. And that's the biggest theme of Dark Souls, that in a world ravaged by corruption, cruelty, death, disease, and suffering, no act can ever be pure. For some, that's a reason to give up and become cruel yourself. For others, there's still reasons to try your best anyway. And Dark Souls subtly shows, time and time again, that there is value in continuing to try to do the right thing, even in a world where right and wrong have had their distinctions gradually eroded. The juxtaposition between the Mushroom family and Sif interests me because it presents the same meaning twice in a row, once through low-level play and then once through high-level play. Sif is a necessary piece of progression and is a big story beat in the game, so watching Sif suffer through your act of killing becomes a really obvious example of how the game presents its ethically ambiguous and existentially uncertain perspective to the player. But the Mushroom family is a non-obvious example of the same thing. We don't have as much context with which to empathize with the Mushroom family or understand them, but that shouldn't matter. Cruelty is not about motivation, it's about effect, and the effect is the same. Murder, destruction, and suffering. Why do you persist in the face of endless suffering? Do you persist so that one day the suffering might end, or do you persist to reap what benefits you can from the suffering around you? Maybe one day it could all be different, but until then, you've got to try something. And in Dark Souls, you have a chance to try to do the right thing at every turn. You can't always know what is and isn't right, but you should try your best anyway, because the world needs it more than you know. Thanks for watching. This video is part of an ongoing series of videos I'm making discussing brief moments in games and how they communicate meaning through play. If you like this video, I recommend the other videos in this series. This video functions in part as a teaser for a long-form video essay I intend to make going in-depth on the existential and ethical themes of Dark Souls. It's going to be a long-term project, so don't expect it to happen for a while, but when it's done, it'll be one of my most ambitious, well-thought-out, and to be honest, lengthy videos. If you're interested in seeing that long-form Dark Souls video, let me know in the comments. It helps me gauge what projects to prioritize next. Lastly, this video is funded by the support from my patrons over on Patreon. Patrons get access to long-form video essays early, get their name in the credits, and help support the creation of future videos for this channel. My hope is to make this channel my primary source of income and to use the funding to help upgrade my equipment so that I can produce higher quality videos and cover a wider range of games, movies, or other pieces of media that can draw out excitement in myself and my viewers. If you'd like to support this channel and see more and better videos from me, please consider joining my Patreon. Thanks again and have a great day, week, month, and year.